Hello and welcome to In Depth. My name is Aditi Nagpal Girotra. The United States of America and the Taliban signed an unprecedented deal to bring peace after 18 years of conflict in Afghanistan. But the accord signed in Doha on Saturday faced its first roadblock sooner than anticipated. Just a day later, Afghanistan's president has publicly rejected the timeline for a prisoner swap with the Taliban. The militant Islamist group had proposed a March 10th deadline for an exchange of prisoners. The peace deal was signed after President Donald Trump called the conflict in Afghanistan one of America's endless wars and vowed to bring the war to a close. In depth today, we'll talk about the genesis of the conflict with Taliban in Afghanistan, the challenges to its peace accord with the US, and the apprehensions it has unleashed among people about its impact on Afghan society. The Doha Agreement has 4 points, including a timeline of 14 months for all US and NATO troops to withdraw from Afghanistan. In this report, let's look at the other significant elements in the US-Taliban peace deal that was signed between the two sides in Doha on 29th of February.
On 29 February 2020, the United States and the Taliban signed a landmark deal to bring to an end the longest war in America's history. The agreement is expected to lead to a dialogue between the Taliban and the Kabul government aimed at bringing peace in the war-torn country. The accord was signed between Zalmay Khalilzad, US Special Representative for Afghanistan Reconciliation, and Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, the political head of the Taliban. The Doha Accord was reached after more than 18 months of negotiations behind closed doors hosted by Qatar. Some crucial elements of the deal include withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan. The United States will draw down to 8,600 troops in 135 days, and the NATO or coalition troop numbers will also be brought down proportionately and simultaneously. Further, all troops will be out within 14 months if the Taliban abide by the terms of the accord. In the future as well, the US will refrain from threatening or using force against Afghanistan or intervening in its domestic affairs. The Taliban's main counter-terrorism commitment is that it will not allow any of its members, other individuals or groups, including Al-Qaeda, to use Afghan soil to threaten the security of the United States and its allies. The Taliban will prevent such groups from recruiting, training and fundraising and will not host them in Afghanistan. The deal also bars the Taliban from providing these terror groups with travel and legal documents. America has pledged to review the current list of sanctions targeting Taliban leaders and members with the goal of removing these measures by 27th of August 2020. UN sanctions on Taliban leaders will be removed by May this year. The deal also stipulates that talks between the Taliban and all Afghan sides will commence on the 10th of March in Oslo in Norway. A ceasefire will only be an item on the agenda of the talks, indicating that actual ceasefire will come with the completion of an Afghan political agreement. The US-Taliban pact envisions the release of up to 5,000 Taliban prisoners by the Afghan government ahead of talks between Afghan factions in Oslo. The Taliban would in turn release up to 1,000 prisoners held by them. The deal concludes with the US and Taliban pledging to seek positive relations with each other, along with whatever government comes out of intra-Afghan talks. The US has also promised to seek economic cooperation for the reconstruction of the war-torn country with the new post-settlement government in Kabul.
The United States and the Taliban have endured decades of hostility and mistrust. Previous talks have faltered. This effort only became real for the United States when the Taliban signaled interest in pursuing peace and ending their relationship with Al-Qaeda and other foreign terrorist groups. They also recognized that military victory was impossible. I then asked Ambassador Khalilzad to serve as our lead negotiator to gauge the Taliban's sincerity.
The negotiations with the Taliban had been going on for quite some time now, and back and forth, for example, happened. The Taliban opened their office in Qatar, in Doha, and from there, at one point, it seemed as if they were running a parallel government. Clearly, Americans now have made this intra-Afghan negotiations the second phase of their compromise. So now the issue is how they have dealt with this problem is that they first concluded the peace deal with the Taliban, under which they are committed to reduce their military footprint in Afghanistan, and they expect that Taliban would now enter into intra-Afghan talks with the Afghan government and also abide by the conditions of not allowing its Afghanistani territory to be used by Al-Qaeda or other terror groups.
Soon after the deal was signed, US President Donald Trump said he would meet Taliban leaders very soon, asserting that it was time that the war against terrorism was fought by someone else, particularly by the countries in the region.
And I'll be meeting personally with Taliban leaders in the not too distant future. And we'll be very much hoping that they will be doing what they say they're going to be doing. They will be killing terrorists. They will be killing some very bad people. They will keep that fight going. We've had tremendous success in Afghanistan in the killing of terrorists, but it's time, after all these years, to go and to bring our people back home. We want to bring our people back home.
Afghan nationals are both wary and hopeful of the new peace deal.
I think it was a very important step towards peace and stability in Afghanistan, and we have to be optimistic towards the next step.
The Taliban chatter is that they have won this war and they have successfully made the United States to talk to them. But the United States have not been militarily defeated. As a matter of a policy change, it started talking to the Taliban. And my belief is that with the signing of this agreement, the war in Afghanistan will not finish. We will have war. This war will only transform in nature, size, and players. We might have reduction in the scale of violence, but definitely not the end of this war.
The US-Taliban deal is seen as a historic opportunity towards negotiating a more sweeping agreement that some hope could eventually end the insurgency of the Taliban, the militant movement that once ruled Afghanistan under a severe Islamic code. The war cost $2 trillion and took away the lives of more than 3,500 American and coalition troops and tens of thousands of Afghans since the US invasion in the aftermath of the 11 September attacks, which were plotted by Al-Qaeda leaders under the protection of the Taliban. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
At the onset of the historic accord, Afghanistan President Ashraf Ghani rejected Taliban's precondition for intra-Afghan talks. He also said that he would not free thousands of Taliban prisoners. However, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo brushed off Ghani's rejection of a key clause of the US-Taliban deal. Our next report looks at the politics of peace negotiation and its future amid fragile political situation in Afghanistan.
The US-Taliban deal signed on the 29th of February was in the making for over a year. But on the 1st of March, Afghanistan President Ashraf Ghani rejected a Taliban demand for the release of 5,000 prisoners as a condition for talks with the Afghan government and civilians. The Afghan president's comments pointed to the first hitch in implementing the fragile deal that is aimed at ending America's longest war after more than 18 years and getting rival Afghan factions to agree on their country's future. Still, the US has said a planned US troop withdrawal over the next 14 months is linked to the Taliban's counter-terrorism performance, not to progress in intra-Afghan talks. Ashraf Ghani also noted that his government would send a delegation to Doha to discuss about the issue before the 10th of March.
هیچ نوع تعهد بر رهایی 50,000 بند بندی وجود نداره. ما بار این موضوع را به صورت شفاف با دکتر سب خلیلزاد و تمام مقامات دیگه شریک ساختیم. این حق قانونی و جزء خود ارادیت مردم افغانستان است. تقاضا شده جزء مذاکرات، جزء از اجندای مذاکرات قرار گرفتن میتونه، اما پیش شرط بوده نمیتونه و موضوع حسن نیت مطرح نیست در این باره. از جهتی که ملت افغانستان باید اعتماد داشته باشه که کسی که رها میشه مقابل از این ملت استادگی نمیکنه.
According to Afghanistan's constitution, the final decision to this regard should go to the National Assembly of Afghanistan, also known as the Parliament of Afghanistan, or goes to referendum. Ashraf Ghani said his government would spare no effort to ensure the restoration of lasting peace in Afghanistan and safeguard all the achievements and values, including the rights of women, achieved over the past 19 years.
We are seeing questions being raised by the Ghani government on the prisoner swap agreement that is part of this deal. Ghani is saying that this is something that it is not acceptable to him because this is something that the government in Kabul has the authority to negotiate, not Americans. So now we will see what happens as on March 10th they will have to come to, they start this process. So whether the Taliban will come to the table without these prisoners being released.
US-Taliban peace deal that would eventually witness the withdrawal of a bulk of American troops from Afghanistan has put the focus on Pakistan. Pakistan has assured the US that it will help maintain peace in landlocked Afghanistan, while intra-Afghan dialogue gathers momentum in the coming months. But there are doubts given Pakistan's track record in arming and financing the Taliban, encouraging Lashkar-e-Taiban to operate from Afghanistan and using the Afghan territory to target India.
They should realize that the United States is, planning to, withdraw, from Afghanistan, and we will always remain neighbors. So a direct approach should be given preference to. If I have an issue with Afghanistan, I will not ask Washington to play a role. I will speak to Kabul directly.
Taliban are directly or indirectly controlling 50% of Afghanistan already. So they are in the same position as they were prior to 2001. What will happen now? Will the atrocities and will the rule, when they finally come into power in Kabul, be any different from what was happening before 2001? Only time will tell. But the signs are that it will not be an easy period for Afghan.
Signing of the historic accord between Washington and the Taliban may seem to be a good step from its surface, but the road ahead will certainly not be easy. However, US Defense Secretary Mark Esper said the US would remain committed to the Afghan security forces. Afghans and many in the region are concerned that the United States could abandon Kabul, much like it was perceived to have left the region after the Soviet Union exited Afghanistan decades ago. With input from Kunal Singh, Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
With this, we'll halt in for a quick breather, but we'll be back soon. Stay tuned with us. After 18 years of conflict, a US-Taliban accord is in place. It comes after many unsuccessful attempts to launch negotiations with the Taliban. Much tragedy has ravaged Afghanistan after the conflict began, even before the US forces arrived in Kabul in 2001. The deal creates a path to launch a formal peace process. It sets the tone for an Afghan dialogue, which would be a tremendous opportunity. But there are also many fears. Let's understand why.
Despite the peace agreement, along with unclear prospects for war-torn Afghanistan's future, there are concerns as to how some of the country's nascent gains of democracy will survive. On the ground, Afghan women are expressing mixed views on the signing of an agreement between the United States and the Taliban. While some hope the deal could pave the way for a potential end of violence that has claimed tens of thousands of lives in the country, others fear the looming prospect that hardline Islamist groups whose rule barred women from education could once again become part of the government.
خیلی خوشحالم که تفاهم‌نامه بین آمریکا و طالبان امضا شده و امیدوارم که دیگه جنگ پایان بیابه و صلح در افغانستان بیایه و همچنان حقوق خانم‌ها مراعات شه.
The apprehensions are justified. When they seized power in Kabul in 1996, the Taliban banned women from education and work and only let them leave their homes in the company of a male relative. Overnight, women disappeared behind the all-enveloping burqa, their activities restricted to their homes.
Taliban is likely to have the same diktat, the same rules of behavior for women as they had before. They might sweet talk the world into thinking that they have changed, they may give a little more freedom to women, but basically they want them inside the chadar, inside the house, and in a very restricted space.
Recently, though, the Taliban have been projecting themselves as more moderate, saying Islam gives women rights in areas such as business and ownership, inheritance, education, work, the choice of a husband, security and well-being. At the same time, they have warned against the mingling of men and women and have denounced those they saw as encouraging women to defy Afghan customs. The agreement sets the stage for peace talks involving Afghan factions that are likely to be complicated. There are also questions about whether Taliban fighters will adhere to the reduction in violence agreement.
ما با توافقنامه‌ای که دیروز صورت گرفت امضا شد خیلی باورمند نیستم و برعکس نگرانم هستم چون یک آینده مبهم و نامعلوم در پشت از این توافقنامه میبینم چون با باور ما طالبان هیچ به صلح باورمند نیستن و اونا اصلا امضایی که کردن به اینا پابند نیستن و اینا گروهی هستن که بارها امتحان خود دادن.
The point that observers currently make is that there have been no concrete concessions from the Taliban. The other question they ask is, will the war really end, given that the militant group is intent on attacking the Afghanistan government?
There are a number of issues on the table at the moment. One, I think the most fundamental one is, can Taliban be trusted? And has Taliban changed? And this is a question that divides the world opinion. I don't think many ordinary Afghans who have lived through the phase where Taliban were ruling in a brutal manner, they would forget that memory. But also countries like India and others who have been at the receiving end of the Taliban would forget how ferocious Taliban can be and how detrimental they can be for the regional security.
Without US fighter jets circling overhead to keep them in check, the concern is as to what will be the protection left for human rights, respect for the constitution of Afghanistan, and the hard-won and always endangered women's rights. There are fears that democratic Afghanistan will cease to exist. But for most Afghans, the Doha agreement still brings a glimmer of hope. Families are hoping that the fighting will be finally brought to an end.
The world consensus is ready for the future of Afghanistan. I think the neighbor people of Afghanistan and also world community want to see Afghanistan stable. And this today is very important, and this is the first step opening the door to the hope of the people of Afghanistan.
Much of this will depend on whether the West can make the Taliban keep their promises and, just as importantly, to actively support a government in Kabul. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
The United States launched an offensive against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan in the wake of 9/11 attacks. This was the beginning of the US-led war on terrorism. And the war in Afghanistan has spanned the administrations of Presidents George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump. In this report, let's take you through the major events in the US war in Afghanistan from 2001 till date.
Around the turn of the new millennium, the Taliban controlled Afghanistan. They allowed the terrorist group Al-Qaeda to run training camps in the country, turning the country into a theatre of the global war on terrorism. 2001 saw the United States launching a retaliation for the 11 September attacks on its soil that killed nearly 3,000 people. Osama bin Laden, the head of the Islamist terror group Al-Qaeda, was quickly identified as the man responsible. The Taliban, who ran Afghanistan and protected bin Laden, refused to hand him over. A month after 9/11, the then US President George W. Bush launched airstrikes against Afghanistan. The US-led forces soon toppled the Taliban that was in power since 1996. But the Taliban did not just disappear. Their influence grew back and they dug in. Since then, the US and its allies have struggled to stop Afghanistan's government from collapsing and to end deadly attacks by the Taliban. In October 2001, the US, along with the Northern Alliance and the ethnic Pashtun anti-Taliban forces, announced the first airstrikes against the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda. In November 2001, the Northern Alliance drove out the Taliban forces and took control of Kabul. Training camps for Al-Qaeda, the terror group run by 9/11 plotter bin Laden, were also hit. Once Kabul fell, the United Nations invited major Afghan factions to a conference in Bonn in Germany. On December 5, 2001, the Afghan factions signed the Bonn Agreement. The Bonn Agreement was followed by a UN Security Council resolution on December 20th that established the International Security Assistance Force, or ISAF. On December 9, 2001, the Taliban surrendered Kandahar and its leader Mullah Omar fled the city. This day marked the official fall of the Taliban.
See, in the last 18 years, America has been at war in Afghanistan after September 11, 2001 attacks happened in Washington and New York, and the Twin Towers fell down. America then, under the George W. Bush administration, decided that it would want to rid Afghanistan of Taliban regime, under whom Al-Qaeda and other terror groups had been operating, but Al-Qaeda in particular, because Al-Qaeda targeted America in September 11 attacks directly. And then the establishment of a relatively democratic government in Kabul also happened. America has invested more than $1 trillion in Afghanistan. America has lost around 2,400 lives, more than 2,400 lives in Afghanistan, along with the other partners from NATO allies. So America has been, for the 18 years, involved in the reconstruction and rebuilding of Afghanistan from the bottom up.
In April 2002, then US President George W. Bush called for reconstruction of Afghanistan. The US Congress earmarked over $38 billion in humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan from 2001 to 2009. In May 2003, the US Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld declared an end to major combat in Afghanistan, reducing the number of American soldiers in the war-torn country. By August 2003, NATO assumed control of ISAF in Afghanistan, and by December 2003, more than 10,000 US soldiers were on the ground. In January 2004, the Afghan Assembly agreed on a constitution for Afghanistan, creating a strong presidential system to unite the country's various ethnic groups. This was seen as a first step towards democracy in Afghanistan. In October 2004, in a historic national balloting, Hamid Karzai became the first democratically elected head of Afghanistan. In May 2005, Afghan President Hamid Karzai and US President George W. Bush issued a joint declaration which gave US forces access to Afghan military facilities to prosecute the war against international terror and the struggle against violent extremism. By 2009, Barack Obama had succeeded Bush when about 68,000 US troops had been deployed in the country. By the end of 2009, Obama sent another 30,000 to fight Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. By 2010, the number of US soldiers had swollen to almost 1 lakh. But for the first time, a time frame was set for their withdrawal by July 2011. In 2011, 10 years after the war in Afghanistan began, Osama bin Laden was eventually tracked by American soldiers in Pakistan and killed. The same year, President Obama outlined a plan to withdraw 30,000 troops by the summer of 2012 and all combat troops by 2014. However, in 2017, the new US President Donald Trump declared pressing ahead with an open-ended military commitment to prevent the emergence of a vacuum for terrorists, adding that decisions about withdrawal would be based on conditions on the ground, and peace talks were initiated and suspended. In October 2018, US officials and Taliban representatives held their first meeting in Doha. The talks continued into the next year for 8 rounds. In February 2019, negotiations between the United States and the Taliban entered their highest level in Doha. US President Donald Trump even hinted that a deal to end America's longest war might be within reach. And finally, in 2020, the breakthrough in the talks came in February with US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announcing that a new deal was on the table. On February 29, the US officials and the Taliban representatives signed the agreement in Doha. Shortly before the deal was signed, a joint statement released by the US and the Afghan government said US and NATO troops would withdraw from Afghanistan within 14 months. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
So with this, it's a wrap on this edition of In Depth. Thank you so much for joining us.